good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us from today. Thanks ever so much for making the time. It's a truly global panel that we are speaking to you from today. I think each of us from our own different time zone. And I think looking at the audience, we are definitely a global one, which is really exciting. I'm speaking to you from Oxford in the UK, and it is my very great privilege and pleasure to chair today's conversation on the launch of Protection Approach's latest publication, Linked Up and Linked In, Networking Local, International Early Warning and Early Response in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. And today we're going to be talking about a report that has been a long time in the making. It has been beset, as so many projects have over the last year, by the difficulties and challenges of COVID, but perhaps it has also given us longer to think and to reflect. Alexandra, who is the lead author on this paper, also had time to have a child while also writing, researching, and then now coming back to us after maternity leave for the launch. So she's been super productive. This paper forms part of a larger 3-year consortium project managed by our very great friends at Peace Direct, called Networking Prevention, Strengthening Networks to Prevent and Respond to Identity-Based Violence. And this is really such an exciting project to be a part of that seeks to improve the ability of civil society networks to monitor, to track, and to report incidents, to ensure that local, national, and international stakeholders are better informed, that they're better placed to make decisions that ultimately will save more lives and that will help to protect and ultimately to prevent different forms of violence, and really to make sure that local civil society is situated right at the heart of our understanding about that prevention, wherever different actors might come from. It's a project that seeks to identify if and how identity-based violence and mass atrocities have different indicators or risk factors that are different from the different manifestations or different pathologies of other forms of violence. And if those indicators can be identified, whether they can then be better integrated into existing local early warning and early response mechanisms, as well as national and international frameworks. In February 2020, just before our worlds all changed forever, in February, Beni Peace Forum and Protection Approaches and the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, better known as ACLED, convened a 3-day workshop in Goma in DRC to improve data collection methods related to the prediction and prevention of identity-based violence within Eastern DRC. And notwithstanding many difficulties of the COVID-19 pandemic, this first phase of the project really sought to sort of bring that objective of identifying risk factors from the local perspective as a new means of documentation and monitoring to life. And a lot of that new data that came out of that workshop is now helping our local partners to more effectively monitor warning signs and develop evidence-based response strategies. And then the next phase of the project that comes after this paper that we'll be talking about today is going to be looking at work with international actors, including the UK government and MONUSCO and other stakeholders, to develop a means of kind of information sharing. And what we'll be talking about today is where some of the evidence for our next stage of the project is going to come from. And so this paper is neither a view from the grassroots nor from elite policy structures, but rather it's horizontal. It's a horizontal analysis of change that draws on the inputs and perspectives and tools of both local and international prevention actors. And that's what makes me so excited about this project, the paper, and where we will go next. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. But before I introduce our panel of fantastic speakers, I would just like to say a few words about our friend Jo Cox, who this paper is dedicated to. But it was a coincidence that we hold today's launch a day after we mark 5 years since she was murdered. And Alex and I actually both met Jo at the same time, following the last thing that we worked on together, the last paper we worked on together at that time on Syria. And Jo, like us, truly believed that Britain could and should be a leader in the prevention of mass atrocity crimes. And this very paper and this project is funded thanks to UK Aid Direct and the Jo Cox Memorial Grant, which is made available through the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom. And I believe that this was the first ever fund created by the UK government to contribute directly to preventing and responding to identity-based violence. And so it's bittersweet that in some ways, thanks to this fund, Jo is still at the heart of British efforts and contributions to the prevention of identity-based violence and mass atrocities. And, you know, Alex and I find it very bittersweet that any changes that might come from this paper are still in some ways connected to Jo and her legacy. And so our paper is dedicated to her. But without further ado, I will introduce you now to our fantastic panel, who will do all of the talking from now on. First of all, it is such a pleasure to be here with Alexandra Buskie, who I have worked on and off with for such a long time, and it was such a real dream to work with her on this paper. Alex is a consultant in human rights, atrocity prevention, global governance, those big, big issues, but also has a knowledge on UK atrocity prevention, you know, that outdates practically everybody. She was in those trenches a long time ago. She has experience working in policy advocacy in the UK, in grassroots human rights education projects in Canada, program evaluation for multilateral organizations and international donors. She's done it all. She has an undergraduate degree in politics and French from the University of Glasgow and a master's in international relations from King's College London. And it is Alex's research and analysis and depth that really is the meat of this paper. And then we have Ashad Sentongo, an also long-standing champion of atrocity prevention, someone who I've had the pleasure of knowing for now really some years. A citizen of Uganda, Dr. Ashad joined the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities in 2014 as Director of Africa Programs. And so he has been working with the African Union, the International Conference on the Great Lakes region and the East Africa community to build networks for genocide and mass atrocity prevention, including national and regional mechanisms and training and technical assistance. And I've had the pleasure of participating in some of those training sessions, and they are just the most impressive curricula and contributions that you know I have ever really seen. Their remarkable work. Ashad's publications focus on mass atrocity prevention mechanisms, identity-based conflicts, conflict transformation, traditional approaches to conflict resolution in Africa and resilience, relationship building, and is one of my favorite people to read as well as to work with. And there are very few people that seem to balance the practical and the academic and the thinking so wonderfully. So thank you so much for joining us, Ashad. And last but by no means least, we've got Lawrence Devlin, who is First Secretary in the Eastern DRC for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office based in Goma, DRC. Lawrence has been in this role since November 2019 and is responsible for political and security reporting, leading small HMG platform and representing the UK in the east of the country, developing all sorts of sort of programmatic facing work, as well as the analysis that comes with that, has been working alongside the development representative in that mission there. Before being in DRC, he was deputy head of the West Africa Conflict Security and Stability Fund, and then before that was in Mali. Joined the FCDO in 2015 as a conflict advisor when he was based in London. And before joining the FCDO, he worked in various conflict-affected countries for NGOs and the private sector, so brings an enormous amount of wealth. And Lawrence has been really just so generous with his time and his team's time as this project has evolved helping us workshop the conclusions. And it is just a great trio of people that we've got for you today. So we're going to go first to Alex, who is going to give you an oversight of the work, of the meat, of our recommendations. We're then going to go to Ashad for some reflections on the paper, and then to Lawrence. Then we will have a bit of a conversation and throw it out to any questions that our audience may have. So you guys know the drill by now. Write your questions in the Q&A box, and I will do my best to get through them. But Alex, please, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's a real delight to be able to present this report on behalf of us both, really. For many years, Kate and I and many others have been advocating for the integration of atrocity prevention into international policy of the UK and other states. We believe that an analysis and understanding of the processes that lead to atrocities and identity-based violence can strengthen the impact and the sustainability of UK programming. So for those of you who are not deep into what atrocity prevention is, I thought I'd give just a quick 101 just to make sure. Atrocity crimes, when I'm mentioning atrocity crimes, I'm talking about genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. And identity-based violence is any act of violence that is motivated by a perpetrator's conceptualization of their victim group's identity. And this can include identity-based atrocity crimes. Atrocity prevention is about ensuring that the most marginalized and at-risk groups are not excluded or further undermined by prevention, protection, and development strategies. So it's about recognizing the patterns of discrimination that can lead to atrocity crimes and countering them and preventing violence before it escalates. And just to be clear that this doesn't replace any conflict prevention, human rights, or peace building activity that's already taking place. It's more of an extension of them. The UK is a supporter of atrocity prevention in international fora like the UN through the responsibility to protect. And it's also committed to doing more to prevent atrocities through its own foreign and development policy. So what this research really tried to do, like Kate said, is to put more meat on the bone of this commitment and look specifically at early warning and prevention work in Eastern DRC. The UK is a major international stakeholder in DRC as a donor and through its financial and political contributions to MONUSCO. And I'll let Lawrence provide more details on the UK's work in DRC. We believe that the findings of this research are applicable to other donors as well and other multilaterals and actors working in the prevention space. Onto this research, at its most basic, I feel like this report is really about how to build trust in early warning systems. It's about how to trust that we understand what to look for when it comes to identity-based violence, how to trust that the system we're working in will understand the implications of what we see and be able to guide our response. And then how to improve levels of trust within a larger network and system of actors working within the early warning space. And in this report, we broke down early warning, the process of early warning, into three parts. It's about recognizing risk, communicating risk, and responding to risk. And I'm going to go through each of these quickly in turn with the time that I have today. So in terms of recognizing risk, to prevent identity-based violence and atrocity crimes, we first need to know who is at risk, how and why, and what protection they might have. Without this information, we may miss the signs that violence is developing in line with patterns of discrimination and exclusion that we've seen can lead to atrocity crimes in other cases and other situations. Today, we have international frameworks with indicators that can help us identify the risks. So there's the UN framework on the prevention of atrocity crimes, which was the first international framework to set out the indicators and risk factors that are common to all 4 atrocity crimes. But what we heard through our research was that this is really just the first step. International frameworks are really important directories, and it's recognized in general that we have to interpret them in context. But we need to reach in and include local communities when we're translating these indicators from the general to the particular. This is so that we can catch the most relevant indicators and work through together these kinds of misunderstandings and miscommunications that we can have between different actors and different stakeholders coming from different perspectives about just the meanings of terms. What does this term mean? What do you mean when you say that this is the person at risk? How do you know that they're at risk? So working through with local actors and creating a common definition and common understanding with the people who are closest to the risk of violence is a really important activity, both in the end game of what you get for the indicators that are defined, but also in the process of working together and talking together and speaking together and improving understanding and trust between the actors. As Kate mentioned, the Protection Approaches and its partners led a workshop in Eastern DRC with local actors working in prevention. And these peace builders identified a number of examples in their own context that they believed demonstrated the intent, motivation, or proof of the preparation for the perpetration of atrocity crimes. Some of these indicators aligned clearly with the international frameworks, like the UN framework on the prevention of atrocity crimes, while others were very, very specific to the context, such as like the theft or killing of cows, or another one was youth groups being vaccinated against bullets and things like that, as sort of showing that there was an intent or motivation to undertake violence. So localizing indicators can help catch any gaps in international approaches. And it's, as I said before, importantly, it's the process of working through together how to develop a common understanding of how identity-based violence plays out in specific contexts among those working in prevention. So on to the next parts of our research, which is about communicating risk. And communicating risk is about how do we raise the alarm when the analysis of indicators point to the potential for atrocity crimes. The DRC has a myriad of early warning initiatives. They're sometimes working together, they're sometimes working in parallel. And the number of different systems isn't necessarily a problem. It's good to have a plurality of viewpoints and methodologies. This isn't a negative thing. What's more problematic and challenging is how they interact, the way information is communicated and shared, and that can be sometimes problematic. I'm sure Ashad is going to give a much more comprehensive view of the system, the early warning systems and networks that are in place in the Eastern DRC. So for now, I'm going to focus on what our research looked at in the UK's approach to early warning. So the UK's approach to early warning is made up of three mechanisms. There's the day-to-day monitoring done by the missions, which I would say is, from what I heard from our interviews, is really the bread and butter of what the staff do every day. They're keeping in touch with partners, they're staying abreast of conflict dynamics. But the way the information moves upwards from the mission to Whitehall is less clear. There's many different ways that it can go up and down. And there's not a clear way of kind of ringing an alarm bell if there are patterns of discrimination, marginalization, or violence that may point to the potential of atrocity crimes. So that's the day-to-day kind of rolling work of early warning. For longer term, the UK has its Countries at Risk of Instability Index, the CRI, which is owned by the Cabinet Office, and the Joint Analysis of Conflict and Stability process, which is a process owned jointly by FCDO and MOD. And I'm not sure if that's going to change or how it's going to change with the merging of the two departments, DFID and FCO. The CRI was an annual mechanism, and the JACS, the Joint Analysis of Conflict and Stability, is sporadic, and it's also not compulsory for all the countries that the UK is working in. It's also a very heavy process. It's difficult to revisit, it's extremely detailed, and it creates a really detailed, nuanced picture of a conflict in the country that the UK is working in. But what's really missing is this light touch way of communicating risk factors that would provide real-time information, provide a moving picture that would help to inform decision-making. If we're looking specifically at whether or not the UK looks at the indicators for atrocity crimes, they're not currently formally included in any of the current guidance on how to conduct the UK's early warning. The current approaches focus on factors relating to state resilience or internal and external pressures, which can touch on factors that lead to atrocity crimes, but there's not an explicit inclusion of atrocity risk. Although I do hear that the JAX is currently being updated and will include some. The guidance isn't yet public, but that's a very exciting development. And I'm looking forward to seeing more of that. And then if we think back to what I was saying before about how we recognize risk and the potent information that local actors hold, in terms of whether or not the UK is reaching into local actors, it's also a little less clear. Local actors aren't often a direct partner of the UK. They're a third tier or fourth tier partner, so they're funded by partners who are funded by the UK. This is understandable. It's difficult to manage many small funds with small amounts of resources. The resource requirements are really high. The UK works closely with larger organizations like MINUSCO, other international NGOs. And what we heard throughout our research is that there is a willingness and desire to reach in to local actors and include their perspectives in the analysis. But we also heard from local peace builders that consistently that local actors need additional funding. They need additional funding to free up the bandwidth to be able to work with each other, to be able to do their work, and to increase trust and reduce competition for resources within early warning, within the early warning space. If the UK was able to consider ways to increase funding to local partners, this would take some of the pressure off. But we also believe that a good avenue to take the research and the next step of this research would really be to look at and see how donors like the UK can still engage with the beneficiaries of early warning initiatives without it solely needing to be based on a relationship based on funding. So how else can we engage with local actors and hear their voices if we're not able to directly fund? Coming back to this idea of trust, the UK has committed to preventing atrocities. So when we look at the early warning mechanisms that are in place, it doesn't seem fair on those working in missions or with missions not to have a shared understanding of what identity-based violence looks like in the context, or any guidance on how to report it and to who. It's asking a lot of officials and those they're working with to try and prevent atrocities without providing much guidance on how to define atrocity risk in context and who to call when the factors are present. Moving on to responding to risk, we build up expectations when we're talking about early warning, when we're talking about funding early warning and developing early warning systems. These expectations need to be met or managed if we're to improve trust in the system and improve the legitimacy of the systems that are in place. Our research, and again, I think Ashad will have a lot more to say on this, our research showed that there's collaboration is a really important challenge for actors working on early warning in DRC. There's a lot of duplication, competition for resources, disappointed expectations, which are leading to mistrust of actors at all levels, local, national, and multilateral actors. So if we want to bolster the legitimacy and efficiency of these systems, we need to be able to back up our commitment with the steps I've already mentioned, knowing how to recognize risk, how to communicate it to decision makers. But if we look again at the UK's system in place, those decision makers need to be able to understand what they're seeing and understand how to respond. And this is really moving much up into the higher policy level of decision making. If we think of how the UK responds to atrocity risk, the UK doesn't currently have a coordinating unit on atrocity prevention. The focal point for the responsibility to protect doesn't currently play the role of a coordinating unit to provide oversight on risk, receive risk reporting, provide guidance on how to respond, a kind of equal to the conflict sensitivity analysis that has been done in development projects. It could be an atrocity risk sensitivity analysis that could be done. It's difficult for officials to know what level of risk is concerning, how to respond to it through programming, both in the long and short term. So this really brings us to the recommendations that we make in our report, which are focused on the UK's current policy dynamics. They're relatively modest. It's more about tweaking what's currently done as opposed to doing a wholesale reform. We recommend that the UK should be doing things like providing training and a playbook for mission staff on recognizing, communicating, and responding to atrocity risk. That they should be integrating an awareness of atrocity risk into country strategies, like the DRC country strategy, and then ensuring that that field level understanding is backed up with expertise on atrocity prevention at Whitehall and in the decision-making arena. We also recommend that the UK should be reaching in more to local partners to place a greater value on their knowledge and their initiatives, and to explore how to increase funding pools. This, we feel, would support the UK to have more impact on preventing atrocities through its programming. And then if we think about the larger network of donors and actors working in this space in Eastern DRC, if we were to mirror this process throughout other parts of early warning systems, we might be able to develop a clearer understanding of atrocity risk in the country. So that's a summary of the research findings. The full report is available online. I'm looking forward to not hearing my voice anymore and having a proper discussion with the other panelists and participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was, yeah, fab. And I also realized that as you closed there, Alex, what I should have also said at the beginning, but forgot, is that this is the public launch of the English version paper. And there will be a corresponding French event, and with our DRC-based civil society partners in later on in the summer. And so that is something else for your diaries if you would like to hear similar things spoken about in French, but also, of course, with different actors and different conversations. But I should have said that earlier. Anyway, now, without further ado, I will hand over to Ashad, whose work on early warning in this region has just informed my thinking for years. And for any of you on this call that haven't read his work, I urge you to Google it and do so. But you don't need to now, because Ashad is here with us. So please, the screen is yours. Please share some reflections, some thoughts. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you everyone for joining us, and also giving me an opportunity to share some reflections on the paper. The reflections I'll share will be largely conceptual, in a sense that this is a field and that is broad, but as you may notice, it is normally in the areas of practice. Academically, it is so well analyzed and exhausted in terms of research and producing material. But in terms of practicing on the ground, it is very sensitive, and many people step away from that. So I would like to start at that point to say that I thank you so much, Kate and the team, for engaging into this work, and most importantly, engaging such a difficult subject of identity-based violence. It is very critical, and I like the way you capture the complex, the broadness of identity as it must be captured, than individuals who sometimes step away and they focus on one aspect or the other. I think the way you approach it is quite good. The issue of identity permeates or cuts across most of the conflicts, if not all the conflicts that characterize the Great Lakes region. I've said in some spaces that the Great Lakes region has not lived a day without war for the last half a century. At any one time in any one country or community, there has been violence and war and killing, and the most common underlying factor is identity, the mobilization of identities, and engaging that area is critical, and bringing it to the mainstream to the level of recommending a government, British government, to pay particular attention to that element and spend time to have a conversation about identity is critical. In some other areas, I've made the comment that in the process of nation formation in Africa, we skipped the stage of having a conversation on how the different identities in Africa could coexist. They were left out, that coexistence, the need to study them, understand their fears early enough, capture them within the dynamics of state building so that there are built-in mechanisms to respond. That step was missed. The assumption was that there is that thing called a structure, you put it into place, you put a constitution and laws, and the citizens will comply. You know, leaving out the critical aspects. What this study does, what this paper does, what the research does, is to contribute to bringing that discussion on the table in policy corridors, in the corridors of power, in the international and local communities, to say, wait a minute, let's revisit and understand identity, bring it down to isolating the key indicators that drive that, much as they are context specific, but let us isolate them. And then let us use them to inform policy, to inform development, to inform programming for social, political, economic progress in our communities. So from that perspective, Kate, I really appreciate the engagement that you took to this this research, and I've spent time making arguments and claiming and arguing and motivating that let's have a conversation about how we can effectively manage identities. This paper interrogates how indicators of stability and violence in North Kivu, South Kivu, Ituri can help to inform early warning and early response. And I think that was a great initiative in a country that has suffered that greatly in ways that everybody knows. The approach on networking prevention, the paper provides, and as what's the name of my colleague who spoke before me? As you were articulating the
Alexandra.
Yes, Alexandra, as you were speaking about risk recognition, communicating risk, responding risks, I like those approaches. The paper, I think people should come out to read these. But what I would have, Kate, you spoke about this, but I didn't find it in the paper, but you mentioned that this paper is horizontal. I like that element. I've done some reading about network analysis in conflict situations. And much as instead of looking at conflict processes hierarchically, a network approach looks at them horizontally through forms of network that actually facilitate mobilization. And the network approach actually helps to reveal who the critical actors in a conflict process are. Network analysis reveals levels and degrees of centrality, betweenness in terms of decision-making, in terms of influence in conflict processes, to be able to identify. On many occasions, we tend to think that because conflicts are analyzed hierarchically, the president or the local chief is the key person in this issue, and therefore let us target him. And yet when you do a network analysis, you discover that the networks within which he operates, there are key decision makers that also influence the way he thinks. This type of approach, if the paper positions the discussion on early warning and early response at that level. That let us think between policy, local activities, programs, and in between there, how can we locate, where is the best space to locate our decisions and our interventions? That is a brilliant approach. And I think the networking prevention approach in the DRC as a heading, that a subheading that I see here, and applying it in recognizing risks, communicating risks, and the way you do explain them in terms of making sure that you enable people to measure and recognize and understand these risks, and providing some checklists that are relevant, in my opinion. I think that is a great contribution to the field also. And I would encourage on many occasions people who are reading about early warning to read this. Also, the paper brings in early warning, but there is a great emphasis on early response, which is very critical. Early warning without response is critical. Now, in some of the literature you may have reviewed and looking at early warning systems in the region, we don't have early warning systems in the region that are conflict-driven and sensitive. There's a number of early warning systems that are there, those ones that are known and established and institutionalized, like the C1, like from by the Africa Union, by IGAD. There are a number of early warning systems, but they are designed for disaster, to identify threats and risks associated with the disaster, famine. Conflict-driven indicators that should trigger responses to prevention are not well developed here. And this is, again, when I was looking at the way you have come up on this table, I think it is on page 27, manifestations of identity-based conflict by, in the DRC, the indicators that you lay out are critical. I was just thinking about the best way to, I'm now involved in an assessment of by USAID on conflicts in the central region in Uganda. And I was trying actually to read and see how these can also help, how this structure can help me understand the conflict process from an early warning perspective in the central region in Kampala. So bringing out conflict sensitive indicators is critical. And I think you are adding knowledge, and in the chapter that I wrote, that you read in Reconstructing Atrocity Prevention, I mentioned that weakness, that challenge in the region, that it is not there. And this therefore provides, helps to cover a gap that is missing. And I'm just hoping that two things will happen. One, that donors are going to borrow onto these to inform their policy formulations, thinking about intercommunal discord, for instance, as an indicator. Disputes between communities, such as unresolved land disputes. If that happens, there's a program in Tanzania. We conducted some training to the National Committee for the Prevention of Genocide, and we trained early warning and early response. So they went into Dodoma and they tried to establish a community-based early warning system. And one of the things they were focusing on only a land dispute, okay? An existence of land dispute. But it is difficult to arrive at understanding that this problem is about land unless you have identified some kind of discord somewhere that leads you to further analysis to locate the actual cause of the problem. So they ended up identifying land as an issue, but much of what they went in to investigate are some intercommunal challenges and violence that was going on, and they didn't know what was happening between pastoralists and other agriculturists. I'm just drawing an example. So moving forward with conflict sensitive and conflict specific indicators is critical. And I'm hoping that at level 1, policymakers will help and donor community will help to utilize these to inform their policies. And 2, that academicians can pick onto these to expand this study and apply them. Because on many occasions, even the early warning systems that we celebrate so much with the Africa Union, and they are still struggling with the developing indicators. But part of that problem is identified again in this paper, where you demonstrate a disconnect between those big, large organizations, donors, and the local community, that the experiences in Kivu do not inform a policy at the Africa Union, or in Britain, in the Parliament, or in the Congress in the United States. The experiences in Kivu, what the Kivu people can actually do, doesn't inform policy in terms of what are the existing opportunities. That is an area that is critical. The other aspect that comes out of the paper very well is the recognition that there are starting points, local capacities for prevention of identity-based violence within communities themselves. Normally, those are not brought into the mainstream. And I like the fact that in as much as you articulate a number of challenges that impede early warning, that influence violence, that you bring about the fact that there are local capacities that exist, that can tap into. There are local networks, there are local ideas and interventions that can be exploited to inform prevention. It is critical. When Olive Richmond was, he wrote an article called Reclaiming Peace in International Relations. And within that article, after analyzing all different, international relation theories, and he comes down to a conclusion that to reclaim peace, international relations requires a three-legged stool. 1, international actors, Kate doing research in Kivu. 2, local political actors that you bring out as key actors in the process, okay? And 3, political leaders, decision makers, policy makers within the conflict area. That those 2 must always come into a conversation to define what he calls hybrid peace or local peace. This localization argument that Alexandra mentioned, the localization of early warning and early response is critical. And if international interventions and donors are to think about early warning to be more effective, this is the approach to take. The departure point should be a recognition that there are local capacities, networks, opportunities that can be exploited to prevent.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Ashad, I'm gonna pause you just for now, just because while I could, listen to you, be so generous about the work that Alex and I have done, but also just continue to pull out these nuances. I just think it is a conversation we will continue to have. And I particularly want to acknowledge your point about the power of network analysis in identifying actors of change. This is, I think that is the future frontier for atrocity prevention. But also I see many fantastic questions coming in the Q&A, and I want all of you to have a chance to reflect on that. But before handing over to Alex to respond to what you were just saying, Ashad, Lawrence, please share some thoughts, such as you may have them, you know, on the paper, on the questions that have come up so far in our conversation today. So pleased you're able to join us. And yeah, the screen and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Kate, and thanks, Alex and Ashad, for your excellent interventions. So yeah, firstly, I thought this was a really great report, and I enjoyed being in the process throughout. I think the paper has made a really useful contribution to how we approach atrocity prevention in country. As the report rightly points out, we don't have a specific framework for dealing with atrocity prevention at the moment within the UK system in DRC. Instead, what we've tended to do is house this under our conflict prevention approach, including our efforts, although nascent, to mainstream conflict sensitivity and an HMG approach to building stability across all of our UK aid programmes in country. But I can appreciate, and the report does a really good job of setting this out, that conflict prevention and atrocity prevention are not the same. And I thought the differences actually identified on page 15 in the report were really useful and definitely kind of food for thought for us. We are frequently asked questions by constituents back in the UK actually on specific kind of conflict dynamics and concerns, and they will raise concerns around the potential for atrocities in particular by, you know, the Allied Democratic Forces or Codeco or the intercommunal conflicts in South Kivu. So it's an issue that we're really alive to, and an issue that we, you know, really try to take very seriously in country. All of these conflicts have an element of kind of deliberate and systematic violence to them, but equally they're also fairly indiscriminate. And as the list in the report notes, there are lots of vulnerable groups that have been identified by the civil society organisations in the East, and with so many active conflicts, the net for kind of doing atrocity prevention in the East would have to be cast really wide. As the paper highlights, the UK are a major donor in DRC. Within our approach to conflict and stability, we work both multilaterally and bilaterally. On the multilateral side, we of course have our significant contribution to MONUSCO through our assessed contributions, around 52 million a year. And then we've got 3 military officers within the peacekeeping mission as well, who cover plans, intelligence, and then we have a gender and child protection officer as well. And we've contributed to financing the joint human rights organisation in country, who I can see made a valuable contribution to this paper as well, so that's great. Bilaterally, we've had a 5-year 70 million peace and stability programme, and of course we're a massive humanitarian donor out here given the huge humanitarian crisis in Eastern DRC in particular. We're also a donor for the Preventing Sexual Violence Initiative, through which we're able to support survivors. So personally, I've often thought we've got quite a good story to tell in terms of working across the kind of wide range of protection issues, both in terms of kind of providing that first line of humanitarian response, emergency and life-saving support, right through to services to those that have survived conflict as well, or, you know, the victims of conflict. I think in country, for me, one of my reflections is that given our significant investment in the UN peacekeeping mission, there's a fine balance between what we do bilaterally and what we do multilaterally. On the early warning side, we've tended to support MONUSCO to deliver on this objective, supporting in particular the JHRO and mandating them mandating the mission to improve their early warning mechanisms. Overall, I think they do a really good job of collecting information through their network of community liaison officers and through the routine human rights monitoring, which is often done in collaboration with civil society organisations and local NGOs. I think where the bigger challenge rests in country is that communication piece, as Alex nicely laid out, and then also in the response. And to be honest, I have a personal view that this will remain a major challenge in country. We've worked with MONUSCO on how to improve their own response rates to community alerts, in particular around areas of like Allied Democratic Force indiscriminate violence. But there's a real challenge that they face in terms of coordinating with the Congolese security services. And I saw one of the questions in Q&A about this kind of gap in terms of security provision, and that's a major, major challenge. On this side, there isn't really a government counterpart with whom early warning and atrocity prevention mechanisms can kind of dock in with. And as the report nicely points out, the Congolese security forces are at times part of the problem as well. As such, I feel that DRC is a really difficult context to deliver on, both of recognising and communicating and responding actually across all three of the elements of atrocity prevention. This is also impacted a little bit by the standing of local NGOs, and as the report notes, the UK doesn't kind of routinely work directly with local civil society organisations or NGOs unless it's through a consortium or through our political engagement, sort of day-to-day routine engagement that's brought out in the report as well. I think the challenge is that there's a high level of competition between CSOs and NGOs on the ground. There's often a politicised nature of their mandates, and therefore there's a prevalence of a lack of trust and slightly partisan approaches, which frankly makes it quite difficult for a mission to engage with the full breadth of NGOs, because we almost have to quality assure the information that we're getting from them at times. So I'll come back to this with a question back to Alex at the end. I think looking ahead in country around the protection issues, we're really focused on a successful transition of the peacekeeping mission, MONUSCO, out of the country, which is meant to happen in the next 3 to 5 years. I think that timeline could potentially slip. There's a real risk there that it carries a big protection risk, given that the mission may leave gaps in terms of monitoring. It will also leave a funding gap for those CSOs with whom JHRO and others collaborate. But I think the biggest gap will probably be on that response side. The fact that there won't be a kind of credible security actor to step into the space that might be left by the peacekeeping mission. So I think it really underlies the importance of this report, because I think in the next 3 to 5 years it's really critical to get something in place that works, and something that will be sustainable post MONUSCO. Finally, I just wanted to come to the recommendations. I thought they were really helpful and certainly worth us as HMG in country considering. The challenge will always be prioritisation, especially in a time of diminished resources. And as I mentioned earlier, our work to mainstream conflict sensitivity and building stability has frankly been quite slow so far in country. Adding atrocity prevention may follow a similar path of quite slow uptake, but it doesn't detract from the need to do it. I do think that we will consider how to incorporate atrocity prevention into our country plan. I think that's a quick win. We're also considering when the time might be right to refresh our JACs. If we did this, then obviously that would incorporate the new atrocity prevention lens as well. There is a JACs Lite, which kind of speaks to Alex's points around it being quite a clunky process. I've been involved in a bunch of them over the years, and they are heavy, but there is a JACs Lite process, and I'm working with the conflict advisor in Kinshasa to think of ways where we might adapt it so that it's easier to manage. And I definitely think training for staff could be a quick win in this area, and would definitely be welcome by myself and colleagues in Kinshasa. I think trickier is the aspects around new programs focused on local NGOs. We understandably have really high standards on management of UK aid money, taxpayers' money, and unfortunately this does impede a lot of direct engagement with local NGOs outside of consortium. We've already worked with kind of a full range of NGOs through consortium and through our contributions to the MONUSCO Stabilisation Coherence Fund. So we do have that kind of donor relationship with them, but it's in a sense dictated by the money that we give to others. I think what we're looking to do instead is how to build better coordination within the NGO network. So we're looking to put a peace building coordinator into a local NGO forum, including international NGOs actually. And then we're also trying to build in some conflict sensitivity training and analysis, which will basically service the wider NGO community. There's no reason why we couldn't also include atrocity prevention into an initiative like that. I think it'd be a neat fit, really. So I think my slight reflection on the sort of second set of recommendations as I see it is that it might be more realistic in the short to medium term for us to integrate atrocity prevention into our existing areas of work rather than start wholesale new areas of work, but I thought the recommendations provide us a really timely challenge. I think you asked me to finish on a question, so I will do, and probably back to Alex. I think, as I touched on, there's a real difficulty for us working with the plethora of local NGOs, given the quite, at times, divisive opinions that they give. And let's be, just being totally honest, like, a lot of them are very politicized and are actually bundled up in some of the conflict dynamics, in particular around South Kivu. I find that the local NGOs are very, very partisan in their approach, and that means that even from a conflict sensitivity stance, it's quite difficult to engage them. So I'm just wondering what your recommendations might be on how to kind of depoliticize the local NGO landscape, and how to build the necessary capacity for atrocity prevention or early warning to be successful, and then obviously how to fit this alongside UNESCO. I'll stop there, thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Lawrence, and not just for sort of that, like, you know, thoughtful and generous, but also kind of really honest reflection on the paper and the recommendations, but just what a joy it was to kind of be able to interact with you and your team as we went through the research process. For us on our side, it added so much, and hopefully is why the report will have some kind of life in it, and we really look forward to kind of helping and working with you in any way we can to take some of those recs forward. Alex, I mean, Lawrence ended with a question there, but Ashad also pulled out so much in his reflections. I'm going to come back to you to kind of take a stab at that question, but also respond to, you know, some of those points in those comments. And then I actually think Ashad has a question for Lawrence, so I will come to Ashad after you. And then hopefully we will have a time for some of the excellent questions in our Q&A.
Thanks, and thank you both, Ashad and Lawrence, for those reflections. That was really, really useful to hear. I want to come back to what Ashad said about this network analysis that to me just sounds so useful, and kind of within the theme of what we were talking about with reaching into local communities to understand who the main players are, and who facilitates mobilization. I thought that was really, really interesting. Thank you. Thank you for that. And on Lawrence's points, I'm really glad to hear that some of the recommendations that we have are of use to you and that could be actually implemented. And yeah, it would be really exciting to see this kind of lens integrated into the country strategy, and into some training. I think there's, like I said before, I don't think we're wanting to start anything new. It's more about just integrating this view, a bit like the conflict sensitivity work that is already being done, just slowly trying to integrate it into what's already being done and how thinking is going on. You put forward a really, really difficult question. Is it really hard, how to depoliticize local NGO landscape? I think what we found with our research with local actors was that there was a high level of competition, like you said, a high level of competition and mistrust among local actors. And I think the way you spoke about how HMG is trying to build better coordination among CSOs, I think that really is the avenue to go down. I don't know, Kate, because you were actually part of that workshop, would you have anything to say about how politicized NGOs were during that work that you were doing in Beni with Beni Peace Forum? Did they have anything to say? Because I apart from what you were talking about on better coordination, I'm not sure.
I actually feel like on that question, I mean, we can ask them when we do our French version of this launch, because, you know, they will be able to speak themselves on those perspectives. Of course, from the UK side, I think where Ashad's point on the kind of usefulness of network analysis is that kind of mapping of who is who and where those influences are coming from and who is influencing whom on a civil society landscape is at the very least very helpful for donors, analysts, researchers, prevention actors. And so that sense of being able to bring a perspective of where grievances are coming from, real or imagined, or when inequalities are coming from, again, real or imagined, often, but not always, explicitly linked to identity. But often, even if not explicitly linked to identity, historically, as Ashad was saying, you dig a little bit and actually you can find some grievances there. That kind of exercise should always be able to bring that additional kind of at least lens of understanding and perspective. But the really cheeky answer I will put in is that I hope that's actually the next stage of the project, and not just from protection approaches, you know, with the consortium partners. You know, the project is about networking prevention. And so it's doing some of that stakeholder mapping ourselves and then bringing international donors to those conversations, so there can be at least some spaces where those difficult conversations can be held. Not wanting to stop you in your flow, Alex, but I'm keen to get to some of our questions. Ashad, I know you had a question for Lawrence, so I'm going to come to you, and then we will then go to the question box. So if you're both able to keep relatively short, even though we're talking about big things, I just want to make sure we get to some of these fantastic questions. But Ashad, over to you.
Thank you, Kate. I was thinking of getting some views from Lawrence in terms of how best can response to early warnings be reconceptualized within the development framework to become more responsive to very local level dynamics. The tendency and much of what appears in terms of the big funds that are given to MONUSCO, to many other international organizations, tends to feed into structural interventions. The local, low-level communal aspects tend to be missing in the description of the areas of priority. If you did the network analysis, whatever, as we are talking about here, you discover a relational dimension to these conflicts, to these challenges that is often missing in development support. And the paper brings out the importance of dealing with the relationships. I'm forgetting the page, but the importance of building local relationships at the local level. Much of the intervention tends to be interrupted by what goes on at the local level. You can spend as many millions, but if communities don't relate well, you'll always go through cycles of, allocations and reallocations of development aid. I'm posing a question: what would be the best approach to reconceptualize responses? And I'm using the word response, recognizing that development aid is part of the response, but it is described insufficiently in terms of responding to the local needs.
Great, thank you so much, Ashad. Lawrence, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, Ashad's picked up an important point that, a lot of the responses so far, in particular through MONUSCO, do tend to appear like structural interventions. I guess the challenge is, so I do think there's scope to reconceptualize responses through local communities, in particular civil society organizations, but there will always be a limit to what they can achieve. So what they won't be able to do is provide kind of immediate security. And that tends to be, when I've been traveling in the East and talking to displaced communities who are sitting under MONUSCO support, what they want primarily is immediate security. And I think that's where there's going to be a limitation on what local NGOs and CSOs can do. I think reconceptualizing aid delivery is a different element to that. And I definitely see that we need to get better at how we get aid to the point of need by working less through the kind of big, heavy aid systems. There's a lot of places in the East that are very inaccessible. So I do think there's a good opportunity there. Thanks.
Fab, thanks so much. I've been scrolling through these many questions, but as ever, we will not be able to get to many of them. I'm going to pose maybe 2 or 3, and then I'll go round the 3 of you, and you can kind of pick and choose as you would like. The first question comes from Nicole Pichet, who is representing the All-Party Parliamentary Human Rights Group in the UK. Can the speakers address the importance of monitoring and challenging virulent hate speech in terms of early warning and early response, RE, risk of identity-based atrocity crimes? In this connection, could they flag up any groups in the Eastern DRC who would they, consider to be vulnerable? And any reflections on that is welcome. A second question is a big one from George Weiss. He actually has asked 4 questions, but there's a lot here and we don't have all of that time. So I'm going to ask his biggest, which is, can anything in DRC work without governance reform? And then maybe we'll just have those 2. I feel like they're good, solid questions. One's a bit more specific, one's a big one. Alex, I will go to you first, then Lawrence, then Ashad, and then we'll see how we can go. But if you can keep your answers to, 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes, that would be fantastic. I know they're big ones for you to grapple with, but yeah, they're good questions. So Alex, over to you.
Thanks. I'm going to look at the question from Nicole Pichet about monitoring and challenging hate speech. That is something that I know that Protection Approaches is working on at the moment with its local partners. And in the report, we have a list of groups that local partners identified as being at risk. They themselves identified these groups. It's not a complete list. There are obviously other groups, but these include the Yira, Pygmy peoples, Hutu, Tutsi, victims of sexual abuse, women and girls, children, members and supporters of opposition political parties, people living in poverty, people living with HIV/AIDS, and people living with disabilities. These were some of the groups that were identified by local partners as being at risk of identity-based violence in North Kivu. So there are some examples throughout the reports of that. And I know that there is other work being done by Protection Approaches about how to collate and monitor the hate speech and like leafleting, I think it is. I'm sure that we can discuss that afterwards if you're interested in having more information about that. Okay, thank you.
It looks like we might have lost Ashad's connection temporarily, but Lawrence, over to you.
Yeah, sure, thanks. I'll try to address both questions. So on Nicole's, yeah, I mean, I think we're really cognizant of the fact that hate speech is used, I'd say, semi-widespread in Eastern DRC. The most keen example of it is in South Kivu, in a place called the High Plateau, where there is the Banyamulenge and various other ethnic groups, and they both engage in hate speech on both sides. It's an issue.
Oh, we did very well for so long that perhaps we're being hit by a couple of connection issues at the same time. It looks like we have possibly also lost Lawrence. So maybe I shall throw one last question at you, Alex, and we can go from there. This is a question from Fred Carver, who says, what does the architecture of protection look like once MONUSCO leaves? Or to put it another way, what should replace MONUSCO, and what role should the UK, UN, local civil society, and the Congolese government, the security sector, etc., plays in whatever comes next? Again, this is a big one, but I suspect that this comes back to some of Ashad's question about network mapping.
Way to end with a huge one, and I think it relates to the other question we had about governance reform. what should replace MONUSCO? It's a really concerning thing to consider, that MONUSCO is going to eventually withdraw. I don't think anyone can look at the situation in DRC and think that the actors are ready for that. And I think as actors working outside of that system, we need, like Kate mentioned, we need to pick up on that network analysis piece and really see who's actually working in these areas. Really zoom in into like localities. Who's actually working in these areas? Who's providing what kind of service, and how is it working? And what are the influences over it? I think that will help us understand a little bit more what architecture is left over if we take MONUSCO out of the picture. I see that Lawrence is back, so perhaps
yeah, let's throw back over to Lawrence. If you have any last reflections before we close up, because I feel like the internet gods are they gave us a good hour.
Yeah, it's quite rare that you don't get a power cut within an hour and a half here, so apologies.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, just to come back on the hate speech, yeah, we're definitely aware of it as a really big issue, in particular in South Kivu, where there is that kind of increase in hate speech on both sides of the conflict, which is really troubling. We as the international community and the UN are alive to it. In fact, I know the UN are taking on quite a lot of work through the Joint Human Rights Organization to basically come up with an action plan on hate speech as a global demand through the UN system, but I think it's particularly pertinent here in Eastern DRC. So I think that's probably where the issues that kind of most powerful right now, and that's the response that's being put in place at the moment. From the UK side, we're doing quite a lot around inter-community dialogues to try to stave off that conflict, but not directly at the moment working on hate speech. And then just to come to George's question in terms of can anything be done without the government reform, and I guess this is probably a good way to close as well. I mean, I personally think not really. And I think it's a real difficulty at the moment. Obviously, there's the institutional reform that needs to be taking place, but we're talking quite a lot at the moment about trying to demobilize armed groups, try to improve the conflict environment in the East, and obviously that would have a knock-on effect to atrocity crimes, but we're not talking enough about security sector reform. And without building the capabilities and kind of really reforming in particular the Congolese army, but also the police, then I think this risk of a protection gap is always going to remain. And if there's a protection gap, then there's obviously also a risk of atrocities being perpetrated. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a great place for us to end, and this kind of what comes next as the future of MONUSCO sort of begins to change and wind down, and whether it's governance or security reform or increasing development or peace building, I think those of us that come from the atrocity prevention or identity-based violence prevention perspective, it's just about integrating that thinking of where the grievances are and the imbalances are and the risks are into those decisions, rather than replacing, replicating or competing with agendas. We have unfortunately run out of time and unfortunately lost Ashad, I suspect, to a similar internet break in Kampala. But just let me really please thank all of you for joining us in the audience, and of course most particularly to Lawrence and Ashad for joining and sharing their reflections, but also really to Alex for doing this work and driving it in the most extraordinary circumstances of COVID and also late stages of pregnancy, and then also editing and juggling it. And it's just, you're an absolute superwoman, and we are ever so grateful to have your brains with us. In terms of the next stages for this project with protection approaches, of course, you know, there is a French version of this report already available, but we will be holding conversations with our local partners over the summer, but also over the next 18 months. You know, we have been in conversation with them already for, you know, well over a year, and that relationship continues. I hope very much protection approaches will be able to play a role where we can in supporting HMG and DRC and kind of taking some of those implementation of recommendations forward. Certainly on that training front seems like a sort of exciting place we can explore next. But for now, thank you ever so much. Enjoy the rest of your days. There were so many questions we couldn't get to, but there will be other moments where Alex will be on an online platform at the very least, where you can engage in those conversations again. So thank you very, very much. Stay safe, stay peaceful, and have a fantastic day.